Today we have with us 4 masters of the word. Let me introduce them to you. The winner of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for Fiction is Junot Diaz, with The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. We had the pleasure of hosting him when the book was first published in 2007, and since then it has gone on to win the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics' Choice Circle Award. This extraordinary work allows the reader to delve into the immigrant experience as we follow Oscar Wilde's family from the Dominican Republic to New Jersey and back again, feeling their exhilarations and their pain. Junot's fiction has appeared in The New Yorker, the Paris Review, the Best American Short Stories, and his debut book, Drown, was met with unprecedented acclaim, and it has grown into a landmark of contemporary fiction. He was born in the Dominican Republic and raised in New Jersey. He lives in New York City and is a professor of writing at MIT. We're anxious for you to meet him. Please welcome Junot Diaz.
I feel like all the introductions are right here. So I know I should just introduce. Yeah, yeah. And I'm a good editor of these things, like Taylor was saying earlier. There's usually more introduction than writer, so I'm like embarrassed to hear these things. Yeah. Thank you for coming out. It's no small thing to take a little time to be with the arts. Yeah. Actually, since we have kind of a big program, I wasn't gonna do any kind of reading. Yeah. If I remember, it's just better to chat a little bit. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's probably wise in this case. Again, I'm a sort of a strange anomaly in the sense that I'm an immigrant kid who almost never writes about immigration. Most of my books take place either before a family has decided to immigrate or many years after they've already settled in. So there's almost no mention of those terrible liminal years when one is becoming or growing into their new country. Part of this, I think, has to do with the enormous difficulty that I've had in figuring out a proper language or a proper narrative to dramatize what those years meant to me, or to create a metaphor sort of explaining those years. I find it far easier to write about the other more stable extremes of either being on the island or being in New Jersey. One of these days I think I'll get around to writing the thing that I'm actually often described as writing, immigrant experience. One day I will actually get to it. But for the moment it has been something that has escaped me. I've written 2 books. The one in question, the one that was honored by the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, is a novel about, among many things, but a Dominican family in New Jersey dealing with one of those things that could be or might not be real, which part of the family believes that it is cursed, and the rest of the family believes that this idea of a curse, of course, is old world nonsense. And I was, at least as a writer, I was very much fascinated by the concept of a curse, because if you're doing what I was interested in doing, which was to write a story about this kind of crazy family and its search for love. I mean, the book really, at the most minimal level, is just a kind of a love story. Each member of the family attempts to find love and succeeds or fails to a certain degree. But, you know, beyond the fact that it's a love story, I really wanted to write this book where it was simultaneously about this kooky family in New Jersey, but also about the larger history of the Dominican Republic and the New World and the United States in the post-war era. And what ends up happening is that you're sort of looking for a way to bridge the individual particularity of one kooky family in New Jersey with these larger national abstractions of the history of what we call the New World? And how do you link the two without one eliminating the other? If you strike a larger historical pose, if you talk about these larger issues, the individual tends to disappear. If you talk about the particularity of the individual, as we know, anytime you really think about how individual we are, the larger categories disappear. It's so hard to generalize once you're dealing at the most particular level. And this is, of course, a narrative problem. And what I discovered was that the best way to, at least in this book, that curses, this idea of a curse, has always been, has traditionally, I shouldn't say always, has traditionally been an answer for bridging the larger national panorama with the very intimate landscape of the individual. And as someone who loves narratives and who loves stories, I've always noticed whether it's a religion, whether it's a classic play, whether it's someone like Faulkner or someone like Melville, whether it's Wagner reclaiming, the sort of Scandinavian traditions, a curse is probably the best bridge for these things. There are other strategies, of course, but I just found that people are so much more willing to believe that the things are happening in a person's life based on some supernatural force than they are if you tell them, you're dating the people that you're dating probably based on your parents' trauma. People hear that and they're just like, oh, you're crazy. But if you tell people, you're having problems dating because your family was cursed, for some reason it's like really a persuasive narrative story, even for people who are deeply empirical. And I think that as a strategy, it proved to be, for me, a very effective way to try to maintain the equilibrium between the larger national story and the smaller particular story. And also, it's very fun. I know it sounds crazy that curses can be fun, but because history, unless you're like us, kind of like history geeks, it doesn't invite much discussion. The average person has little interest in how history plays itself. But a metaphor like a curse, which involves history as a component of it, and involves not only past history but future history, seems to invite a lot of participation in people. Yeah, if you've ever met a family who's ever had this concept that their family is somehow cursed or destined, everyone has got an opinion. And because the American condition, whether it's the American of the New World or the American of our current geographic place, the United States, has been afflicted by this notion that, are we a blessed nation, as our mythology leads us to believe? Are we, God's gift to the earth? Are we God's chosen country? Or does the other narrative, which is almost automatically evoked whenever you produce a concept of a chosen people, or are we secretly a curse on the planet? Is this, as Faulkner often talked about in his letters, is the paradise that this place could have been actually had been robbed because of individual and community action? So is the South the fallen child, because of the original sin of slavery? So, I mean, a lot of this stuff was the kind of brainy, nerdy things that were driving this book. But again, what I found myself going back to again and again was how deeply invested, how sort of important love is to the human condition. Again, I'm 40 years old, which is in some ways certainly far from when I was 8, 9, 10, 11, when I was first learning about love, and certainly far from my mother's sense of what love means. But what I discovered, at least in these short years, is that love seems to be only possible if you do this very strange thing, which is to put yourself entirely in someone else's power. Love can't exist without vulnerability. Vulnerability is a total prerequisite for love, which for a family like this one, a family that has dealt with so many of what we would call like the American traumas, making yourself vulnerable, making yourself, putting yourself entirely in someone else's hands, was their great challenge. And I was really moved by this notion of how difficult it is for survivors to actually love. Anyone who survived something very difficult, having to put yourself back into a vulnerable position, I always think that that's an enormous challenge. It's an enormous challenge. And so, I mean, these are the mostly the kind of the broad outlines of what I was up to on this book. As a writer, you're the least qualified to talk about your own text, of course. The joke that most writers know is that the only person who can no longer enter, the only person who cannot enter the text is the person who wrote it. So it's the one thing that you write off when you actually write a book, is your ability to return to it in any significant way. So most of my comments are shadowed by the fact that I see this text from an incredible distance. I understand it very, very poorly. And the way that it's moved, whomever it has moved, is as much a mystery to me as it is a mystery of how I came to write this particular story at this particular time. So, I mean, those are about all the comments I have, and I will now cede the podium to my my next colleague.
Very nice. Thank you, Juno, for giving us some insight into your work. The winner of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for Nonfiction is Edwige Danticat with Brother, I'm Dying. We've also had the pleasure of hosting her in the past with her book, The Farming of Bones. In her new stirring memoir, she takes us into the heart of her family. It is a story that focuses strongly on her father and his brother, her uncle, with whom she lived in Haiti until she was 12 years old, before joining her father in America. It's the immigrant experience mixed with the results of the deterioration of the political situation in Haiti, and it is a powerful rendering of family love and devotion. Brother, I'm Dying won the National Book Critics Circle Award for autobiography. We are so pleased she is here with us today to accept the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for Nonfiction. Please welcome Edwige Danticat.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I am honored to be here with my fellow finalists and winners, and with you folks. This book, Brother, I'm Dying, actually I'll start by explaining the title. Maybe that's a good way to start. It is, it's a memoir, but it's really, I think it's a collective memoir. It's not a memoir in the sense of memoir so much. And Brother, I'm Dying, actually the title comes from a moment when my uncle who raised me in Haiti, my mother and father left there to move to the United States my father when I was 2 and my mother when I was 4. And they left me with my Uncle Joseph, who was a minister in a neighborhood in Haiti called Bel Air, which when they had moved there from the provinces was a really beautiful hilly place, and they were amongst the first families to move there. And then over the years had become what they would call in Haiti a popular neighborhood, which becomes a kind of a bidonville, what others would call a slum. And my uncle had throughout that whole time stayed there and started a church and a clinic and a school, and was growing old there. But when my parents left, they left us with him, and when he became, after a couple of years after he became a minister, he got throat cancer, and did this whole journey that was always described almost as a mythic journey in my family, to go get this, to meet these American doctors in the south of Haiti who come only a few times a year, and they finally were able to diagnose his cancer. And by then my father was living in the States also with my cousin, my uncle's son. And so they said, well, you have this surgery you have to go have. You can't have it. These doctors couldn't perform it at this clinic in Haiti. And they said, well, you have to go have it in the States. And so my uncle went to New York and was staying with his son soon after. He was supposed to have the surgery in a week or so. But that one night he just, he couldn't breathe. And suddenly was home alone in his son's apartment, and then he called my father, who was not far away, and he said, "Frère m'a mouri," which means, "Brother, I'm dying." And my father says to him on the phone, just, try to just open the door and he'll call an ambulance. And so the ambulance came, and my uncle was really dying in the ambulance, so much so that they had to do like a quick tracheotomy on him during the transport to the hospital. And he always, when he got a voice box years later and was telling us about this surgery, would recall it. He said he felt like he felt like it was like killing a pig, because he had no anesthesia, there was no time, and he was getting this anesthesia. So my father, as they were both dying at the same time, and this book is also there's stories about the very different journeys that they ended up taking. Because my uncle never wanted to leave. First of all, he never wanted to leave Bel Air, which became, over time, an increasingly more and more violent neighborhood. But he never wanted to leave Haiti. And my father, wanted as soon as he could, as a young man, to leave Haiti and have a different life. So they were 30 years living in different countries and never really saw each other. They saw each other once a year. And my father was always reluctant, for reasons that he didn't share in detail, to visit Haiti. And I remember after 25 years going on the trip with him, the two of us going together, and I asked him on the plane, well, why, haven't you want to come? He said, well, all my friends are dead. And my father had left during the dictatorship and had lost a lot of friends in his age. He felt as though he had escaped, and then some part of him always felt like it was reckless of my uncle to have stayed there. But my uncle had a very long life there. He lived to be 81 years old until the fall of 2004, when there was it was the anniversary of the departure of President Aristide, and there was then the gang activity in Bel Air had increased, and when the UN came in, there was an operation on the fall of 2004 where the UN police and the Haitian police got on the roof of his church and shot at some people from the roof of the church. And finally, so this balance that he had managed to maintain with the gangs there, where you sort of, because he had known these young men since they were born, basically, and he knew a lot of them. And suddenly they turned against him and threatened his life, and somehow he managed to hide in the neighborhood. And because he had family here, he took a flight to Miami, and the church, he had lost everything, like the church, the house, everything was taken away. When he got here at the airport in Miami, he was asked how long he was staying, and he had been coming here for 30 years, at least once, twice a year. And when they asked him, he knew that this time he would be overstaying the visa, and he said he wanted temporary asylum. And at 81 years old, he was arrested, brought to the Chrome Detention Center in Miami. He was taking medication for blood pressure and inflamed prostate, which were taken away from him. And then he died a few days later in the custody of the U.S. government. So this is what really, I had never thought of writing a memoir until my uncle died. And then when I started, we had to file Freedom of Information requests to get his papers. And when I started looking at his documents, I thought, oh, this is, if you wrote this as fiction, I think people wouldn't believe it in some of the things in the records. And so I decided to write it as this book as a testament to his life, because I think you know, if you come from these kinds of families where people struggle, and they're really, you know, I always tell people I feel like I've had great opportunities in this country, but we've also paid a dear price for it. And I think that's what gets lost sometimes in this conversation about immigration, you know, this sense that we're taking. And people don't also realize, you know, and, you know, my uncle's, I'll close with this, like his most vivid childhood memory was of 1933 when, you know, there was U.S. occupation of Haiti that lasted 19 years. And he said his father was part of a group that fought against the occupation and forbid him to go where he knew some of these U.S. Marines who were very, mostly Southern, and were astounded that one of them was actually quoted as saying, you know, to think niggers speaking French, you know, they were astounded that there were black people running a place. And so my uncle remembers going to this marketplace near where they lived and seeing these young Marines kicking somebody's head around like a soccer ball, and that was his most striking childhood memory. And for us, I mean, the biggest thing wrestling with this book, the fact that when my uncle died, we couldn't go to Haiti to bury him. So the fact that he's now buried in Queens, New York, next to my father, is something that that I sort of wrestled with explaining, and sort of how his you know, his journey ended in such a surprising way for him and for us. And so these are the things that I tried to untangle in the book. I haven't done them all, but the book, in a way, was a process, as all writing is, and towards that a bit of greater, clearer understanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Edwidge. The runner-up for the Nonfiction Award is Colin Murphy with Are We Rome? The Fall of an Empire and the Fate of America. And what a fascinating book this is, especially at this time in America's history. Colin challenges us to examine the history of the Roman Empire and compare it to what is happening in our country today. And very importantly, he reveals how we can avoid Rome's demise. As managing editor and then editor of Atlantic Monthly for more than 2 decades, Mr. Murphy is well versed in bringing important subjects to the attention of the public. Along other lines, he and his father, John Colin Murphy, wrote the comic strip Prince Valiant from the mid-70s to 2004. And he is the author of The Word According to Eve, Women and the Bible in Ancient Times and Our Own. We are pleased to have him with us to tell us more about Are We Rome? Please welcome Colin Murphy.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here back in Dayton, where I did some of the research for a previous book, but especially with this distinguished company here and with all of you. This book has its origins really in a coming together of 2 things. One of them is simply my career as a magazine editor. Magazine editors are notoriously a superficial lot. We are, you know, like bees just flitting from flower to flower, just trying to see what's out there. And you couldn't help be a magazine editor through the 80s and 90s and into our own decade now without a sense of something having changed direction in this country. Leave aside for the moment what that is, but things seem to have gotten off the track in a number of different ways. And then secondly, there was something, it seemed, just in the air. And what was in the air was this comparison between ancient Rome and modern America. And it comes up in all sorts of ways. Most recently in that HBO documentary about ancient Rome, it's hard not to look at that documentary and understand that the producers there were thinking about modern times, not ancient times. We call football players gladiators. We talk about American forces overseas as legions. We refer to the American president as an imperial president sometimes. And so this kind of language, the architecture of Washington, and so on, has been really part of the background of American political and social history, not only in recent decades, but stretching back a long period of time. So this combination of two factors really led me to to look into the question of, well, if this comparison is coming up all the time, is there anything to it? Is it just one of these facile, glib comparisons, or does it have anything to teach us? Can it be used as, say, a lens to look more closely at American issues, even if a parallel between the two places is only useful up to a point? That's what I set out to do in this book, and I discovered a number of things. One of them was simply how far back this comparison goes in American history. You know, the founding fathers were steeped in the comparison of ancient Rome and modern, to them, America. Of course, they had a very particular reason. They were concerned about the process of setting up a republic. And they knew that Rome had once been a republic, and it had become something else. It had become an autocratic state, and not a very nice one at that, in the process of becoming an empire. They wanted to make sure that that didn't happen. That was really their preoccupation. Our own preoccupation since the fall of the Soviet Union has been something else. There's been the sense that we have slipped into the role of the world's sole superpower, partly out of a sense that this is something maybe we wanted, partly out of obligations being thrust upon us. But whatever the reason, with the decline of the end of the Cold War, we were in a very different place. And you began to hear overtly Roman language being used. You began to hear columnists talk about how this is time for the Pax Americana, like the old Pax Romana, when the Romans enforced peace throughout the world that they knew. You began to hear people talk about how this was the time for us to really push our way onto other parts of the world. So as I began to look into the America and Rome comparison, I came to several conclusions, and let me just list some of them briefly, and then I'll end with one large thought about a way in which we're not like Rome. Obviously, Rome was never a democracy as we are. Obviously, Rome never ended slavery as we certainly did. Rome had very little middle class, which is really the essential part of our own society. But a number of things strike me as actually valid parallels. One of them has to do with the role of the military and military power, and the degree to which economic resources have to be diverted to the military, and the kind of overstretch that results. I think there's a very real parallel there. I think there's a parallel in terms of what happens between public and private power. Power is fluid, and there are times when the public part of our government and of our society has more of it, and times when the private sector seems to be waxing in terms of the amount that it has. We seem to be in a time when power is really shifting to the private side, and Rome was a society where power really shifted towards the private side, and some of the consequences are not good. I think there's a parallel in terms of the mindset of the capital, whether it's walls or a beltway. There's a real insularity. It's a kind of insularity that New York does not have, for instance, or that even London or Paris doesn't have. But Washington and Rome share a real sense of what happens here in these few square miles really is the only important thing in the world. There's a parallel in terms of American ignorance of cultures outside our own. Romans had something very similar. And there's also a parallel in terms of the ambivalent reaction towards immigration, which for the Romans was both essential and also something that they feared, and yet was something that really was responsible for keeping their society as vital as it was for as long as it was. I think there's something that we can see there in the Roman example. Here's the big difference, and it's the difference that gives me the most hope. Americans don't think like Romans in one large way. The Romans were a very complacent people. At the very top, if you were among the members of the elite, you would have had a sense that civilization had reached the top, that there was no further that advancement can go, that life was as good as it was going to get, and the task was just simply to perpetuate the way things are forever. This is a very non-American idea. We think about our children as hopefully leading lives better than we will lead. We think of society as a place where there are unmet needs, and even though we disagree as to how to meet those needs, we acknowledge that they exist. This sense of reinvention, constant reinvention, and I think a basic non-complacency is the fundamental difference between the ancient Rome and modern America. And as I say, it is the one element that when I look at the problems that we face, it is the one that gives me the most heart. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We appreciate your optimistic attitude there. The winner of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for fiction, the runner-up, is Daniel Alacon, and he's not able to be with us today. His book is The Last City Radio, and it takes place in nameless South American country and illustrates war's devastating impact on a society transformed by violence. Now we move in a little different direction. The winner of the Lifetime Achievement Award is Taylor Branch, whose Pulitzer Prize-winning trilogy, America in the King Years, is widely considered the definitive history of Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. It takes us through the years of 1954 to King's assassination in 1968. The trilogy includes Parting the Waters, which also won the National Book Critics Circle Award, Pillar of Fire, and At Canaan's Edge. It's an extraordinary body of work that has taken decades to compile and gives us a comprehensive study of this quintessential man of peace, Martin Luther King Jr. Please join me in welcoming and honoring this man for his extraordinary body of work, Mr. Taylor Branch.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here in Dayton, where the peace accord that ended the Bosnian War was hammered out. I think that's something for everybody here to be proud of, and I hope you can lift that in awareness. I think that it touches not only the past, but I hope what our future will be if we can recover the optimistic side that Cullen was just talking about. It strikes me, being in this company, that there are so many moments of that I share, even though I don't write fiction and I don't write books like theirs. I've been absorbed and enthralled in history for half my life now in this movement history. But as they were speaking this morning, I touched on so many of the things that they were talking about. This movement grew out of something that started as small as a very small inspiration that made people vulnerable to love. If the descriptions of people who would go out for a sit-in and make themselves vulnerable, most of them you've never heard of, I'd never heard of, willing to die but not to kill for, a conception of common citizenship, started very, very small. And those people were really remarkable. Several thousand pages later, for me, they're always trying to appeal for what America's about, like Cullen is talking about. What is the purpose and the essence of our country, and where do we stand? Their weapon to raise those questions was nonviolence, which Mark Kurlansky wrote about last year. So a lot of these things, in my view, come together. Nonviolence was the most powerful idea of the movement, but it was also the first to become passé. You never hear about it very much. Mark and I and people who care about it are lepers in the intellectual world because nonviolence is not respectable. But it was very powerful then, and it rose up to consume the world. And I just want to tell one little story, because toward the end of the book, the movement has taken hold of the whole country and indeed the whole world in the Voting Rights Act. And in the middle of the Voting Rights Act, there are these wonderful phone conversations that you can go hear now of Lyndon Johnson talking on the telephone to people. And the ones I want to cite to you are his telephone conversations with Ted Kennedy, who was a brand new, very young junior senator. And in the middle of the Voting Rights Act, Johnson calls Ted Kennedy and says, "Where is my goddamned immigration bill?" And what he meant was that American immigration law in 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was before Congress, was still governed by the National Origins Restrictions Act of 1924, which codified the world by race and essentially blocked legal immigration from most of the world. Over 80% of the slots that were reserved for 3 countries: Germany, Ireland, and England. All of sub-Saharan Africa and Asia were blotted out. And it arose from what Johnson called scientific racism. He says we have 2 kinds of racism in America: scientific racism and ignorant country clan racism. And we were writing then about ignorant country clan racism, but he said scientific racism came out of the Ivy League at the turn of the last century in the eugenics movement, and classified the races, and ultimately wound up saying that we do not want legal immigrants from the lower ranges of human intelligence, which was the vast part of the world. And it blocked immigration. You couldn't come. Johnson said the Southerners are prostrate, during the fight over the Voting Rights Act. We've got to rush through and reform immigration before they realize what hit them. Where's my goddamn immigration bill? And he literally did get the repeal of the National Origins Immigration Act passed 3 weeks after the Voting Rights Act. They broke a filibuster. The Southerners couldn't fight it. It was the identical vote in both the House and the Senate. And he went up to the Statue of Liberty and signed the Immigration Reform Act of 1965 and stood under this statue and said, "With this pen we repeal the National Origins immigration restriction. Henceforth, the whole world will stand first come, first serve for the slots that we have for legal immigration. Never again will the twin barriers of prejudice and privilege shadow the gate to liberty." And he said that this law is based on the principle that no foreigner is too foreign to be a fellow citizen. The New York Times the next day wrote that he signed a law that was a blow against Fidel Castro because it made it easier for Cuban immigrants to come in the United States. I don't know of any more blatant misreading of the purpose, the intent, and the historic consequence of a law than that. The New York Times was, and all the press, was so caught up in the Cold War reality that they had no other framework on this reform than the notion that he was trying to hit Fidel Castro in the snout by letting in more Cubans, which had never been a problem before. The fact was that this was a fundamental change of the way America views the world, codified in our law, consistent with the civil rights movement and consistent with American freedom. And it has changed, literally and figuratively, the face of the world slowly in the 43 years since the Immigration Reform Act. And it is one of the positive things that in the midst of terrorism and hostility towards illegal immigrants, we are unconscious of. That is part of our heritage growing out of the stories of vulnerability and movement. So I just wanted, and if you listen to these phone conversations of Lyndon Johnson talking about the Immigration Reform Act. And there was a really, I'll end with, there was a really shrewd little political thing, because when he'd get through talking to Ted Kennedy, he would be talking to his aides, and you could hear him on the phone, and he'd say, I put Ted Kennedy in charge of that for one reason. He's a freshman. He shouldn't be able to have a bill like this as the floor manager. But his daddy always resented the fact that the Irish were treated as bad as they were up in Boston. And it's in his blood and in his genes that deep down beneath all of his money is a concern for immigrants, and that he will work his butt off to get this bill passed. So Johnson is trying to figure out, but the animation of it, together with the unconscious effect that it's had for us and the lost heritage of the Immigration Reform Act, is one of the many, many small things that come out of this legacy of that movement that I want to leave you with. Thank you for coming.